Why did I throw my sister's cat off the balcony? I was sitting in my roach-infested studio when my sister called me crying. Sis, my rent just went up. I need $2,000. Cassandra, when I told you I would help until you got back on your feet, I didn't mean 3 years of me funding your life while you did nothing to help yourself. She didn't respond, and just added my parents to the call. As soon as they joined, I knew what was coming. We know you can afford more. Don't be greedy, you know your sister suffers from mental health issues. Oh, I knew. Because they never let me forget. I just sent her $1,300 and called it a day. The next morning, I was eating ramen noodles for breakfast when she texted. My therapist says I need a cat for emotional support. An hour later, she sent me a link to some exotic breed that cost $1,000. My hands were shaking from exhaustion. I'd been pulling double shifts just to cover last month's emergency. But somehow I found myself at the ATM again. The cat arrived the following week. This beautiful Russian blue she named Mr. Whiskers. For exactly 3 days, everything was quiet. Then came the text about special food, special litter, special everything. My parents called before I could even respond. It's just cat food. Stop being so difficult. I remember staring at my phone, thinking about how I'd vouched for her with my friend who managed a call center. Perfect job, work from home, choose your hours, no video calls required. She quit on day 2 because the computer screen gave me anxiety. My friend hasn't spoken to me since. That's when something inside me finally snapped. I blocked her number and texted my parents. I'm done. She can figure it out herself. 2 days of silence. Then my dad called and his voice was different. Quiet. Too quiet. You need to come to Cassandra's apartment. Now. My stomach dropped. The way he said it, I thought she'd done something to herself. I drove there so fast I don't even remember the route. When I got there, the door was open. My whole family was crowded in her living room. Parents, aunts, even my cousin who never shows up to anything. They all looked at me like I was a murderer. Cassandra was sobbing on the couch, mascara running down her face in these perfect black streams. You killed him, she wailed. You killed Mr. Whiskers. My mom grabbed my arm, her nails digging in. Come see what you did. They dragged me to the balcony, and there was Mr. Whiskers, laid out on one of her patio chairs like he was sleeping. You poisoned him while I was on my walk today, Cassandra shrieked, because I couldn't afford his special food after you cut me off. Something felt wrong. I reached out to touch him, and that's when I knew. The body was cold. Not just cold. Frozen solid. This cat had been dead for at least a week. My mind started racing. The insurance. She'd mentioned pet insurance when she first got him. This was about money. It was always about money. How could you? My dad's voice cracked. We're disgusted with you. My mom was already pulling out her checkbook. We'll cover the funeral costs, she said to Cassandra. And next month's rent. It's the least we can do after what your sister did. I looked at them all standing there. My parents who'd bankrolled her for years while I ate ramen. My relatives who always praised her for trying so hard, and Cassandra with her perfectly timed tears. They all believed I'd murdered this cat out of spite. And suddenly I realized she'd set this whole thing up. The walk, the timing, the frozen body positioned just right. You think I poisoned him this morning? I asked, my voice surprisingly steady. My mom gasped. Don't you dare disrespect his body. Haven't you done enough? I picked up Mr. Whiskers. He was rigid as a board, like picking up a brick wrapped in fur. Cassandra's eyes went wide. Put him down! The insurance needs to see. She caught herself, but it was too late. If I killed him today, I said, holding the frozen cat up for everyone to see, then watch what happens when a fresh body falls. No! Cassandra lunged forward, but I'd already made my decision. I threw Mr. Whiskers off that third-floor balcony with everything I had. The sound he made when he hit the concrete wasn't a soft thud. It was a loud crack, like dropping a frozen turkey. He actually bounced. The silence was deafening. Everyone stared down at the parking lot, then back at me, then at Cassandra. That cat's been dead for at least a week, I said. Fresh bodies don't bounce. Cassandra's face went white. Maybe rigor mortis, but even she knew how stupid that sounded. You could see it clicking in everyone's heads. The way she'd called them all here. The specific timing. For the first time in 3 years, she had nothing to say. Luckily, I didn't have that problem. And by the time I was finished, well, let's just say I wasn't the only one throwing things off the balcony. I stood there on the balcony watching my entire family stare down at the parking lot where Mr. Whiskers' frozen body had shattered on impact. The silence stretched for what felt like forever, before Aunt Gwendolyn broke it with a quiet statement. My parents looked at Cassandra, then at me, then back at the parking lot, their faces showing the exact moment their certainty cracked. You could actually see it happening, like watching ice break apart on a frozen lake. My dad's mouth opened and closed without any sound coming out. My mom's hand went to her throat. Cassandra started stammering about how maybe the freezer in her apartment malfunctioned and somehow froze him without her knowing. Nobody was buying it, and I could see it in their faces. The excuse was so weak it actually made things worse. My dad stepped forward and asked her directly when she last saw Mr. Whiskers alive. She couldn't give a straight answer, just kept repeating different versions of a few days ago, while her eyes darted around looking for an escape. First it was 3 days, then maybe 4, then she wasn't sure exactly. Each change made her look guiltier. My mom tried to salvage the situation by suggesting we all just calm down and discuss this rationally inside. But my cousin, who never speaks up at family gatherings, said flatly that frozen bodies don't lie. Then he asked Cassandra point blank if she killed her own cat for insurance money. The accusation hanging in the air made Cassandra's face go bright red. She opened her mouth to protest, but nothing came out at first. I jumped in before she could recover and told them all about the job I got her with my friend at the call center. How she quit after 2 days because of anxiety, even though there were no video calls, and she could choose her own hours. My friend hasn't spoken to me since because I vouched for Cassandra, and she made me look like an idiot. The family members who didn't know about this exchanged uncomfortable glances. I saw my dad's jaw tighten. Cassandra tried to redirect by crying harder and saying, I've always been jealous of her, that I've never understood her mental health struggles. But Aunt Gwendolyn cut her off and said that mental health issues don't explain insurance fraud. My mom started to defend Cassandra but stopped mid-sentence when she realized she had no actual defense for a frozen cat. What could she possibly say? That depression makes you freeze dead animals? My dad asked Cassandra directly about the pet insurance and how much the policy was worth. She refused to answer at first, shaking her head and looking at the floor. But when he threatened to call the insurance company himself right now, she admitted it was a $5,000 policy. I felt my hands shaking because that was more than I'd given her in the last 4 months combined, and she was planning to pocket it all. $5,000 for a cat I'd bought her in the first place. I finally let loose everything I'd been holding back for 3 years, my voice getting louder with each sentence. The double shifts, the ramen for breakfast, the constant emergency texts, the guilt trips from my parents every single time I hesitated to send money. My mom tried to interrupt, but I didn't let her. I just kept going until every ounce of resentment was out in the open. I told them about eating the same meal for weeks straight while Cassandra posted photos of restaurant brunches on social media. About working until my feet bled while she slept until noon. About the roaches in my studio apartment that I couldn't afford to leave because every extra dollar went to her fake crises. My dad's face did something I'd never seen before. This mixture of shame and anger that made him look 10 years older in about 30 seconds. He asked Cassandra if she'd been lying about other emergencies too, and the way she wouldn't meet his eyes told everyone the answer. Aunt Gwendolyn said quietly that she'd been suspicious for a while but didn't want to cause family drama. That made my mom whip around to stare at her, but Gwendolyn just shrugged. My mom made one last attempt to defend Cassandra by saying that even if she made mistakes, I didn't have to throw a dead cat off a balcony like a psychopath. I pointed out that I threw a frozen cat off a balcony to prove it was frozen, and if that made me a psychopath, then what did faking a pet's death for money make Cassandra? Nobody had an answer for that. The silence was even heavier than before. Cassandra suddenly switched tactics and started apologizing, saying she'd been so depressed and desperate and didn't know what else to do. But I was done falling for her performance, so I asked her exactly when Mr. Whiskers died and what she did with the body while waiting to stage this scene. She couldn't answer, just kept crying and saying she didn't remember, which made it even more obvious this was planned. You don't forget putting a dead cat in your freezer. You don't forget keeping it there for over a week. You don't forget thawing it out just enough to position it on a chair for maximum dramatic effect. My cousin pulled out his phone and started tapping at the screen while everyone stood there in shocked silence. He scrolled for a minute and then started reading out loud about pet insurance fraud being a misdemeanor in our state, with fines up to $10,000 and possible jail time depending on the amount involved. Cassandra's face went from white to almost gray, and she reached out like she was going to grab the phone from his hands. She started begging him to put it away, her voice getting higher and more panicked with each word, saying this was a family matter and we didn't need to bring legal stuff into it. My cousin just kept reading, his voice flat and factual, about how attempting to defraud an insurance company was taken seriously and could result in criminal charges even for first-time offenders. Aunt Gwendolyn stepped forward and said this stopped being just a family matter the second Cassandra tried to frame me for animal cruelty in front of everyone. She pointed at me and then at Cassandra and said that if the cat had actually been freshly dead, I would have looked like a complete monster throwing it off the balcony, and that was clearly part of Cassandra's plan all along. My mom opened her mouth to protest, but Gwendolyn held up her hand and told her to be quiet for once, and actually listen to what was happening instead of automatically defending Cassandra like she always did. The sharpness in Gwendolyn's voice made my mom's mouth snap shut, and she actually took a step backward. Gwendolyn kept going, saying she'd watched this pattern for years, and it was time someone in this family faced some actual consequences for their actions instead of getting bailed out over and over. I pulled out my phone with shaking hands and opened my banking app. I started reading off the transfers one by one, my voice getting steadier as I went through the list. $1,500 for rent in March. $2,000 for car repairs in April that apparently never happened since there was a nail salon charge the same day. $800 for medical bills in May. $1,000 for Mr. Whiskers. $600 for special cat supplies. Another $1,200 for rent in June. The numbers kept coming and I watched my dad's face change with each one. When I got to the total and said it was over $20,000 in 3 years, my dad made this choking sound and grabbed the back of the couch. His face went from shame to pure anger in about 5 seconds, and he stared at Cassandra like he'd never seen her before. My mom tried to argue that I made good money so I could afford to help my sister, and that's when I completely lost it. I told her I made decent money, but not great money, and I'd been living in a roach-infested studio apartment eating ramen noodles for dinner, because every single extra dollar went to Cassandra's fake emergencies. My voice cracked when I said I hadn't bought new clothes in 2 years, except for work uniforms, and I hadn't gone on a vacation since college because I couldn't afford it. I told her about the double shifts I'd been working until my feet bled and how I'd been so exhausted I could barely function, but I kept sending money anyway because they made me feel like a terrible person if I didn't. My hands were shaking so hard I almost dropped my phone and I could feel tears starting, but I was too angry to actually cry. Cassandra suddenly jumped up and made a run for her bedroom, but my dad moved faster than I'd ever seen him move. He blocked the doorway and told her to sit down, and his voice had this cold quality I'd never heard before in my entire life. Even my mom didn't try to defend her this time, just stood there with her hand over her mouth. My dad said Cassandra was going to explain every single lie starting with when the cat actually died and how long she'd been planning this whole setup. He crossed his arms and waited, and the silence in the room was so heavy it felt hard to breathe. After what felt like forever, Cassandra admitted Mr. Whiskers died about 10 days ago, from what she thought was eating something bad. Maybe a plant or cleaning product she'd left out. She said she panicked about losing her emotional support animal and didn't know what to do, so she put him in the freezer while she figured out a plan. The way she described it was so casual, like she was talking about putting leftovers away instead of a dead cat. She said she kept him wrapped in a towel in the back of the freezer behind some frozen pizzas and took him out yesterday to let him thaw enough to position on the chair. My stomach turned listening to her talk about it like it was no big deal. My dad asked about the insurance policy and when exactly she bought it. Cassandra looked at the floor and said she got it 2 months ago after doing research online about how much emotional support animal claims paid out. She admitted she'd been planning to fake some kind of accident to make it look natural, but then the cat actually died, and she saw it as an opportunity. She said the timing worked out because I'd just cut her off so she could blame me and make it look believable. The premeditation of it all made even my mom look sick, and she sat down on the couch like her legs wouldn't hold her up anymore. Aunt Gwendolyn asked what Cassandra's plan was after getting the insurance money, and Cassandra started crying again. She said through her tears that she was going to use it to pay me back and get her life together, and maybe go back to the school. I actually laughed out loud because that was such obvious garbage, and I asked her why she didn't just tell the truth about the cat dying and ask for help with a new one like a normal person would. She didn't have an answer for that, just kept crying and saying she didn't know. She wasn't thinking clearly. She was so depressed she couldn't make good decisions. My cousin pointed out that Cassandra's story didn't make any sense because she'd called the whole family here to witness me supposedly killing her cat. He said that meant she was planning to frame me as part of the insurance claim and probably use everyone's testimony to back up her story. Cassandra tried to deny it, but he kept pushing, asking why else she would stage such a big scene with so many witnesses if she wasn't planning to use it somehow. He said the insurance company would have wanted proof and statements, and she'd set it up perfectly to have a whole room full of people who saw me get blamed. Cassandra opened her mouth and closed it again without saying anything because there was no good answer. I remembered something and asked Cassandra about the walk she was supposedly on when the cat died this morning. She froze completely and her eyes went wide. I realized right then that there was no walk at all and she'd been hiding somewhere in the apartment waiting for me to arrive and discover the body. I asked her where she'd actually been and she wouldn't answer, so I asked my dad if he'd seen her when he got here. He said the apartment door had been unlocked, but Cassandra came out of her bedroom a few minutes after everyone arrived, claiming she'd just gotten back from her walk. My dad looked at Cassandra and demanded to know if that was true, if she'd been hiding in her bedroom the whole time. When Cassandra didn't deny it, just sat there crying, my dad actually looked like he might throw up and he had to sit down next to my mom. My mom made this sound that wasn't quite crying, more like all the air leaving her body at once. She pressed both hands against her face and her shoulders started shaking. Nobody moved to comfort her. Aunt Gwendolyn watched my mom for a few seconds before speaking in this gentle but firm voice that somehow made everything she said hit harder. She told my mom that she didn't want to know how bad things were because it was easier to pressure me than deal with Cassandra's real problems. The words just hung there in the air and my mom kept her hands over her face. I watched my dad stare at the floor and realized he knew Aunt Gwendolyn was right. The whole room felt heavy with that truth. My cousin shifted his weight and looked uncomfortable but didn't disagree. Even Cassandra stayed quiet, probably hoping everyone would forget about her if she just sat there long enough. My dad lifted his head and looked directly at me. He asked how much money I'd actually sent Cassandra over the 3 years, including everything that wasn't in my bank app. I pulled out my phone with shaking hands and started going through everything. The Venmo transfers to her friends when she claimed she couldn't access her account. The cash I'd handed over during family dinners. The times I paid her landlord directly because she said she was about to be evicted. The utility companies I called with my credit card because her power was supposedly getting shut off. I added it up twice because I couldn't believe the number. Almost $30,000. My voice cracked when I said it out loud. My mom's hands dropped from her face and she said that couldn't be right, there was no way. I turned my phone screen toward her and scrolled through the records. Month after month of transfers and payments and emergency loans that were never emergencies. Her face did this thing where all the color just drained out and her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She looked at my dad like she was waiting for him to say I was lying, but he was staring at my phone screen with this sick expression. Cassandra sat up straighter and wiped her eyes. She said she'd pay me back every penny if I just didn't report the insurance fraud. Her voice had this desperate edge to it, like she was trying one last manipulation. Before I could respond, my dad told her to shut up. Just flat out told her to be quiet. Then he turned to me and asked what I wanted to do. The question caught me off guard because I realized he was right. This was the first time in 3 years that anyone in my family had asked what I wanted instead of what Cassandra needed. I opened my mouth but couldn't get words out at first. My throat felt tight and my eyes were burning, but I refused to cry in front of them. I told them I was done giving Cassandra money. Done being the family ATM. Done being guilted into funding her lifestyle while I struggled to pay my own rent. My mom started to say something about family obligations, but I cut her off before she could finish. I said family obligations go both ways, and Cassandra had never once helped me, or even tried to improve her own situation. She'd just taken and taken and taken, while everyone made excuses for her. The silence that followed felt amazing. Nobody argued. Nobody told me I was being too harsh or that I needed to understand Cassandra's struggles. They just sat there and absorbed what I'd said. My dad nodded slowly like he was finally understanding something he should have seen years ago. My cousin cleared his throat and said he could help me file a police report about the insurance fraud if I wanted to go that route. Cassandra's head snapped up and she started begging. She said she'd do anything, get a job, pay me back, just please don't involve the police. The words came out in this rush like she thought if she talked fast enough she could fix everything. I looked at her and felt nothing. No anger, no pity, just this complete emptiness where my sympathy used to be. I told her I needed time to think about it, but either way I was never sending her another dollar. She opened her mouth to argue, but my dad gave her this look that made her close it again. The power dynamic in the room had completely shifted, and everyone could feel it. Aunt Gwendolyn stood up and said we needed to deal with the cat's body in the parking lot before someone called animal control or the police themselves. My dad and cousin got up without a word and headed for the door. The rest of us just sat there in this uncomfortable silence. Cassandra wouldn't look at anyone. She stared down at her hands while tears dripped onto her lap. My mom kept glancing between me and Cassandra like she wanted to say something but couldn't figure out what. I scrolled through my phone looking at all the money transfers and felt sick. 3 years of my life spent working double shifts so Cassandra could get her nails done. When my dad came back up, he was carrying a black garbage bag that bulged in the middle. He looked completely defeated, like he'd aged 10 years in the past hour. He said we needed to take the cat to a vet to confirm cause and time of death before making any decisions about insurance fraud charges. Cassandra protested and said that wasn't necessary. We all knew what happened now. My dad ignored her completely. He didn't even look in her direction, just kept talking to the rest of us about finding a vet who could do the examination. It might have been the first time I'd ever seen him ignore Cassandra when she was talking. My mom watched this happen with wide eyes like she was seeing a stranger instead of her husband. My mom asked if we could all just go home and discuss this later when emotions weren't so high. I said no immediately. We were settling this right now because I wasn't giving anyone time to convince me I was being too harsh, or that I should give Cassandra another chance. I'd seen this pattern before. Everyone would go home. My parents would talk themselves into feeling sorry for Cassandra again, and by tomorrow they'd be calling me to say I was overreacting. Aunt Gwendolyn backed me up and said everything needed to be addressed today while the truth was fresh. My mom looked like she wanted to argue, but she couldn't find the words. I turned to Cassandra and demanded that she give me access to her bank accounts and credit cards so I could see exactly where all my money went. She said no at first, pulling her phone against her chest. My dad stood up and told her it was either that or he called the police right now. His hand was already reaching for his phone. Cassandra looked around the room, but nobody was coming to her rescue this time. She handed over her phone with shaking hands. I grabbed it and started scrolling through her transaction history while everyone watched over my shoulder. The password was still the same one she'd been using since high school, because of course it was. The bank statements showed regular charges at restaurants I couldn't afford to eat at, nail salon appointments every 2 weeks, online shopping sites with dozens of transactions, a gym membership she'd apparently never mentioned needing money for. I scrolled back through months of statements and there was no evidence of the emergencies she'd claimed, no car repair bills or medical payments or utility shutoffs, just endless spending on herself while I ate ramen for breakfast. My hands were shaking with rage as I held up the phone to show my parents. There was a $200 brunch charge from last week. The same week she'd texted me begging for rent money because she was about to be evicted. My mom gasped and said, maybe that was a mistake. Maybe someone stole her card. I showed her 3 more brunch charges from the previous month, all over $100. All on Sundays while I was working double shifts at the hospital. My mom opened her mouth and I knew exactly what was coming. She started saying that Cassandra deserved to treat herself sometimes, and mental health meant self-care, and everyone needed little luxuries. Something inside me snapped completely. I screamed that I hadn't had brunch in 3 years, not once, while Cassandra spent my double shift money on bottomless mimosas every Sunday. My voice cracked on the last word, and I didn't care who heard me. I told her I worked 16-hour shifts and came home to ramen while my sister posted Instagram photos of fancy egg dishes and champagne glasses. My dad reached over and put his hand on my mom's arm. He told her to stop defending the indefensible. His voice was quiet but firm in a way I'd never heard before. My mom's mouth closed and she pulled her arm away from him, but she didn't say anything else. Right then, Cassandra's phone buzzed on the coffee table. The screen lit up with a text notification. I could see the preview from where I stood. Someone named V was asking if she got the insurance payout yet, and when she was paying back the money she borrowed. My hand shot out and grabbed the phone before Cassandra could react. She lunged forward, but I stepped back and unlocked it with the same password she'd been using since high school. I opened the text thread and started scrolling. Months of messages filled the screen. Cassandra borrowing money from multiple people with promises to pay them back after her big payout. There were at least 5 different names in her recent messages. Each person had loaned her hundreds or thousands of dollars. I started reading the messages out loud. My voice got steadier with each revelation. Cassandra sank further into the couch like she was trying to disappear into the cushions. One message thread showed her asking someone for $2,000. She promised to pay back $3,000 once her inheritance came through. The date was from 6 weeks ago. My dad's head snapped up and he asked what inheritance she was talking about. Cassandra's face went red and then white. She stammered something about a trust fund. My dad asked her directly what trust fund and from who. Cassandra admitted in a tiny voice that she'd been telling people our grandmother left her money in a trust she couldn't access yet. The silence that followed felt like it lasted forever. Aunt Gwendolyn spoke up from the corner where she'd been watching everything. She pointed out that our grandmother was still alive and living in Florida. She'd just talked to her on the phone yesterday about her bridge club. The absurdity of the lie hung in the air. My cousin actually laughed. It wasn't a happy sound, but it broke some of the tension. He said something about how deep the lies went. My mom looked like she'd aged 5 years in the last hour. Her face had gone gray, and she kept opening and closing her mouth without making any sound. My dad stood up. His movements were slow and deliberate. He looked at Cassandra, and his face was completely blank. He told her she had 2 choices. She could come with him right now to the insurance company to cancel the claim and confess the fraud, or he would call the police and let them handle it. Those were the only 2 options. Cassandra started begging. She asked if there was a third option. My dad said no. Just those 2 choices. He pulled out his phone and looked at the time. He told her she had 60 seconds to decide. The countdown started. I watched the seconds tick by on the wall clock. Nobody moved. Cassandra looked around the room, but everyone avoided her eyes. She kept opening her mouth like she wanted to negotiate, but my dad's face stopped her. At 58 seconds, she whispered that she'd go to the insurance company. My dad nodded. He said I was coming too as a witness. Aunt Gwendolyn stepped forward and volunteered to drive us all since emotions were too high for safe driving. My mom said she was coming as well. Nobody argued with her, even though it felt like she was still trying to protect Cassandra somehow. My dad told my cousin to stay at the apartment. He needed someone here to prevent tampering with evidence. My cousin said he'd use the time to document everything with photos and videos. He already had his phone out and was taking pictures of the open freezer and the bank statements spread across the coffee table. We all moved toward the door. The car ride felt surreal. Aunt Gwendolyn drove while my dad sat in the passenger seat. I ended up in the back between my mom and Cassandra. The silence was broken only by Cassandra's occasional sniffles. I stared out the window and watched the buildings pass by. I felt absolutely nothing. It was like I'd used up all my emotions for the day, and now I was just going through the motions. My body was there, but my mind felt disconnected from everything happening. The insurance company building appeared after about 15 minutes. We parked and walked inside. The lobby was generic with beige walls and corporate art. A receptionist directed us to the claims department on the 3rd floor. We took the elevator up. At the insurance company office, we met with Elodie Sanderson. She was an investigator who came out to greet us in the waiting area. She took one look at our family dynamic and seemed to understand immediately that something serious was happening. Her eyes moved from my dad's stern face to Cassandra's tear-streaked cheeks, to my blank expression. She led us into a conference room with a long table and too many chairs. My dad explained the situation in surprisingly clear terms. He laid out the timeline of the cat's death and the frozen body and the attempted insurance claim. Cassandra sat there looking like she wanted to disappear through the floor. Elodie listened carefully and took detailed notes on a yellow legal pad. She asked Cassandra direct questions about when she purchased the policy. Cassandra answered in a whisper. Elodie asked when the cat actually died. Cassandra said about 10 days before the incident. Elodie asked what her intentions were with the claim. Cassandra tried to minimize everything. She said she just panicked and made bad decisions. Elodie wasn't having it. She pointed out that insurance fraud was a serious crime. She said voluntary confession might help, but it wouldn't erase consequences. There would be legal ramifications regardless. My mom reached across the table for Cassandra's hand. Cassandra pulled away. It might have been the first time she'd ever rejected mom's comfort. Elodie turned to me. She asked about the frozen cat and the balcony incident. I explained everything in a flat voice. The frozen body, the way it bounced when it hit the concrete, Cassandra's slip about the insurance needing to see the body, the whole elaborate setup with the family witnesses. Elodie's eyebrows went up. She wrote something down and underlined it twice. She said that attempting to frame a family member as part of an insurance fraud scheme significantly worsened the case. That elevated it beyond simple fraud into something more serious. Cassandra started crying harder. The sound filled the small conference room. Elodie just passed her a tissue box from the credenza and kept writing notes. Her pen moved steadily across the paper while Cassandra's sobs got louder. Elodie set down her pen and looked at my dad. She said she needed to keep the cat's body for a full veterinary examination to confirm the time and cause of death. My dad nodded and reached for the garbage bag he'd brought in from the parking lot. He handed it across the table to Elodie like he was passing over groceries, not his daughter's dead frozen cat. Elodie took the bag without even blinking, just set it carefully on the floor beside her chair. I guess dead frozen cats were just another Tuesday for her. She told us the vet results would take a few days to come back, but based on everything I described about the body being frozen solid, she felt confident about the timeline. Cassandra's sobs got quieter, like she was running out of steam. Elodie turned back to her notes and started explaining what happens next. She said the insurance company would definitely not be paying out the claim. Her voice was flat and professional when she said they'd likely be pursuing criminal charges given the clear signs of planning and attempted fraud. Cassandra's head snapped up and she started begging. She said she'd do anything. She'd withdraw the claim right now. Just please don't press charges. Elodie's expression didn't change at all. She explained it was out of her hands now and the legal department would be making the final decision about prosecution. My mom leaned forward and asked if there were any other options, any way to make this go away. Elodie looked at her directly and said no. There weren't any alternatives once fraud was proven with this much evidence. The room went quiet except for Cassandra's sniffling. Elodie gathered up her notes and stood, which seemed to be our signal that the meeting was over. We filed out of the insurance office in silence. The elevator ride down felt longer than the ride up. Nobody spoke until we got to the parking lot. That's when my mom started talking about getting Cassandra a lawyer, saying we needed to find someone good who specialized in this kind of thing. I stopped walking and turned to face her. I told her that was fine if she wanted to do that, but I wasn't paying for it. I said neither should they since they'd already spent years funding Cassandra's lifestyle while I ate ramen. My mom opened her mouth to argue, but my dad cut her off. He said I was right, that Cassandra needed to face real consequences for once instead of being bailed out. My mom looked at him like he'd just slapped her. She didn't argue, though, just pressed her lips together and got in the car. Aunt Gwendolyn drove us back to Cassandra's apartment where my cousin was waiting. He met us at the door with his phone in hand, looking pleased with himself. He'd spent the time documenting everything with photos and videos. He showed us pictures of the freezer with frost patterns where the cat had been stored. He'd found empty pet food containers in the trash that proved Cassandra hadn't been feeding him. The apartment itself told a story too. Expensive furniture and decorations everywhere that I'd unknowingly funded with my emergency money. Then my cousin showed us what he'd found in Cassandra's desk drawer. The original insurance policy paperwork was there, along with a notebook full of handwritten notes about how to stage an accident. There were different scenarios crossed out, timing plans, even a list of family members to invite as witnesses. The evidence was so clear it made me feel sick. This wasn't a desperate mistake. It was weeks of careful planning. I looked at my parents standing there staring at the notebook. I told them I was blocking Cassandra's number, and I didn't want them passing along any requests for money or guilt trips about me abandoning her. My dad nodded immediately and said that was fair. My mom started to protest, saying we couldn't just cut Cassandra off completely. I felt something hard settle in my chest. I reminded her that I didn't cut Cassandra off. I just stopped being her personal ATM, and there was a huge difference between the two. My mom looked like she wanted to argue more, but she just turned away instead. Aunt Gwendolyn touched my arm gently. She offered to let me stay at her place for a few days if I needed space from everything. I accepted so fast it probably seemed rude. The thought of going back to my roach-infested studio after all this felt impossible to handle. My mom made this dismissive sound and said I was being dramatic. Gwendolyn turned on her immediately. She said I'd earned the right to be dramatic after 3 years of being exploited and my mom needed to stop minimizing what had happened here. My mom's face went red, but she didn't respond. Before we left, I made myself look at Cassandra one more time. She was sitting on her couch surrounded by all the expensive furniture and decorations I'd unknowingly paid for over the years. She wouldn't meet my eyes, just stared at her hands in her lap. I told her I hoped she figured out her life, but I wouldn't be part of it anymore. Then I walked out without waiting for any response. I heard my mom call after me, but I kept walking. At Aunt Gwendolyn's house, I finally broke down and cried for the first time all day. She didn't try to hug me or fix anything, just let me sit on her couch and sob while she made tea in the kitchen. When she came back with 2 mugs, I started talking. Everything poured out. All the years of guilt trips and emergency texts and feeling like a bad person for wanting to keep my own money. Gwendolyn listened without interrupting. She told me that setting boundaries wasn't cruel. It was necessary. She said my parents' guilt about Cassandra's mental health didn't mean I had to sacrifice my own life and well-being. Her support felt like the first time anyone in my family had truly been on my side. instead of just trying to keep the peace. I stayed up late that night in her guest room, staring at the ceiling and feeling completely empty. The next morning, I woke up to my phone buzzing nonstop. 17 missed calls from my mom. I listened to her voicemail with my stomach in knots. She said I needed to reconsider pressing charges because it would ruin Cassandra's life, that I was being cruel and vindictive. I didn't call her back. Instead, I texted my dad and asked him to handle my mom because I couldn't deal with the guilt trips right now. His response came back within seconds. He said he'd take care of it and apologized for not seeing the situation clearly sooner. That message made me cry again, but in a different way. 3 days later, my phone rang with a number I recognized. Elodie from the insurance company. I answered and she got straight to the point. The veterinary examination confirmed that Mr. Whiskers died about 10 to 12 days before the balcony incident. The vet thought it was probably from eating some kind of toxic plant. Nothing suspicious about the actual cause of death. But the timeline proved everything. Cassandra had kept that body frozen in her apartment while she planned out her fraud scheme. Elodie said the insurance company was definitely pursuing criminal charges, and the prosecutor's office would be contacting me soon for a formal statement. I thanked her and hung up. Then I sat there on Gwendolyn's couch holding my phone and feeling absolutely nothing. No satisfaction, no anger, no sadness. Just this weird empty calm like I'd finally stopped carrying something heavy that I'd been holding for years. I texted Damon the next morning and asked if he wanted to grab coffee. He responded in under a minute saying he'd been waiting to hear from me and wanted to know what the hell was going on with my family. We met at this place near his apartment, and the second I sat down, everything just poured out. The frozen cat, the insurance fraud, the years of money I'd sent, all of it. His eyes got wider with each detail, and when I got to the part about throwing Mr. Whiskers off the balcony, he actually laughed out loud before catching himself. He said he couldn't believe Cassandra had the nerve to try framing me for killing a cat that was already dead. I told him about the insurance company pursuing charges, and he nodded like that made total sense. Then he pulled out his laptop and said we should look at apartments since I'd actually have money now. We spent the next 3 hours scrolling through listings, and I felt this weird excitement building in my chest. A 1-bedroom with actual windows and no roaches. A kitchen where I could cook real food. A bathroom that didn't have mold in the corners. Damon kept pointing out places near good restaurants and parks, talking about my life like it was something worth planning for instead of just surviving. For the first time in years, I wasn't thinking about Cassandra's next emergency or my parents' next guilt trip. I was thinking about where I wanted to live and what kind of furniture I'd buy and whether I wanted hardwood floors or carpet. 2 days later, I was sitting in Gwendolyn's living room looking at apartment applications when someone knocked on the door. Gwendolyn was in the shower, so I answered it, and there was my mom standing on the porch with red eyes and tissues in her hand. She pushed past me into the house before I could say anything. She started talking immediately about how I needed to call the insurance company and tell them it was all a misunderstanding. I just stared at her and said I couldn't drop charges I didn't file. The insurance company was handling it themselves because fraud is a crime against them, not against me. She grabbed my arms and said I was tearing the family apart, that Cassandra was having panic attacks and couldn't sleep. I felt my hands curl into fists and had to physically stop myself from screaming that Cassandra tore the family apart by being a manipulative liar for 3 years. My mom kept going, saying that Cassandra made a mistake, but she was still my sister, and I was being cruel. She said families forgive each other and move on, that holding grudges was toxic. I told her this wasn't a grudge, it was consequences. And maybe if Cassandra had faced consequences years ago, she wouldn't have escalated to insurance fraud. Gwendolyn came out of the bathroom in her robe with wet hair and immediately told my mom she needed to leave. My mom spun around and started yelling at her, saying she'd turned me against Cassandra and poisoned my mind. Gwendolyn didn't raise her voice, just said calmly that my mom had been enabling destructive behavior for years, and it was time to let Cassandra face real consequences. My mom's face went bright red, and she said Gwendolyn didn't understand because she didn't have kids. Gwendolyn said she understood perfectly well that protecting someone from consequences wasn't love, it was harm. She walked to the door and opened it, standing there waiting. My mom looked at me like I was supposed to defend her or ask her to stay. When I didn't say anything, she grabbed her purse and left, slamming the door so hard a picture frame fell off the wall. I expected to feel guilty, but instead I just felt relieved. Gwendolyn picked up the picture frame and said my mom would either figure it out or she wouldn't. But either way, I didn't have to set myself on fire to keep other people warm. A week went by with no contact from my parents. I helped Gwendolyn with grocery shopping and started applying for apartments, and tried not to check my phone every 5 minutes. Then one afternoon I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. The guy on the other end said his name was Vikram, and he was Cassandra's ex-boyfriend from 2 years ago. He'd heard through mutual friends what happened with the frozen cat, and wanted to talk to me about similar situations during their relationship. My stomach dropped, but I agreed to meet him for coffee. He was already sitting at a table when I arrived, this tall guy with dark hair and tired eyes. He shook my hand and got right to the point. He'd lent Cassandra thousands of dollars over the year they dated for various emergencies that turned out to be fake. A medical crisis that never happened. Car repairs for a car that ran fine. Rent payments for an apartment she wasn't actually behind on. He pulled out his phone and started showing me bank transfers, each one with a text from Cassandra explaining why she desperately needed the money. The amounts made me feel sick because they were so similar to what I'd been sending. 2,000 here, 1,500 there, always with some urgent crisis attached. Vikram scrolled back further in his messages and showed me texts where Cassandra used the exact same manipulation tactics she'd used on me. Threats of self-harm if he didn't help her financially. Messages saying her therapist recommended expensive treatments she couldn't afford. Screenshots of fake medical bills and past due notices. He said he finally broke up with her when he realized she was lying about her therapist recommending a $3,000 treatment program. He'd called the therapist's office to ask about payment plans, and they had no record of recommending any such thing. The pattern going back years made something click in my head. This wasn't about mental health issues making her struggle with money. This was calculated manipulation, a system she'd perfected over time. Vikram said he'd lost almost $20,000 before he figured it out. He'd felt guilty for months after the breakup, wondering if he'd abandoned someone who really needed help. Then he heard from a mutual friend about another guy she'd dated after him who had the same experience. That's when he realized it was a pattern, not a crisis. I asked Vikram if he'd be willing to talk to the prosecutor about Cassandra's history of financial manipulation. He didn't even hesitate, just said yes immediately. He wanted to help prevent her from doing this to other people. We exchanged contact information, and he told me I did the right thing by cutting her off. He said he wished he'd done it sooner instead of wasting 2 years trying to save someone who didn't want to be saved. His words hit me hard because I'd spent 3 years doing the exact same thing. We sat there for another hour comparing notes about Cassandra's tactics, and it was almost funny how identical her approach had been with both of us. The same emergency texts, the same guilt trips, the same promises to pay us back that never materialized. Before we left the coffee shop, Vikram said something that stuck with me. He said the hardest part was accepting that someone you care about is capable of such calculated deception, that the person you thought you knew was actually performing a role designed to extract resources. I drove back to Gwendolyn's feeling validated in a way I hadn't expected. 3 days later, my phone rang with a call from the prosecutor's office. A woman who introduced herself as an assistant district attorney said they needed a formal statement about the incident. I drove downtown to the courthouse and spent 2 hours in a small office going through everything with her. She took notes on a legal pad and asked detailed questions about the timeline, the frozen cat, Cassandra's slip about the insurance, and the family dynamics. When I got to the part about Cassandra trying to frame me for animal cruelty, the prosecutor actually looked appalled. She said the attempted framing aspect significantly strengthened their case. She asked if I was aware of other victims, and I gave her Vikram's contact information. I also mentioned the text messages from people Cassandra owed money to that I'd found on her phone. The prosecutor said they'd follow up on all of it and thanked me for being so thorough. She explained that insurance fraud cases often came down to proving intent, and the evidence we had made intent very clear. As I left the courthouse, I felt this strange mix of satisfaction and sadness. Satisfaction that Cassandra was finally facing consequences. Sadness that it had come to this at all. That evening, my dad called. His voice sounded different, quieter and more tired than I'd ever heard it. He said he and my mom were going to therapy to work through their enabling behavior and the family dynamics that let this situation get so bad. He apologized again for not protecting me from Cassandra's manipulation, for always taking her side, for making me feel like I was wrong for wanting to keep my own money. I told him I appreciated the apology, but I needed time before we could rebuild our relationship. He said he understood completely and didn't push. He asked if I was doing okay, and I said I was staying with Gwendolyn and looking at apartments. He offered to help with the deposit, but I told him no. I needed to do this on my own with my own money. There was a long pause, and then he said he was proud of me for setting boundaries. We hung up, and I sat there staring at my phone, feeling like maybe eventually things could be okay with him, even if they'd never be the same. Damon helped me move into my new apartment 2 weeks later. It was a 1-bedroom on the 2nd floor of a building with actual maintenance and no roaches. The kitchen had new appliances, and the bathroom had good water pressure, and there was a small balcony where I could sit without worrying about frozen cats. We spent all day carrying boxes up the stairs and assembling furniture I'd bought from IKEA. As we unpacked, I realized I was setting up a space that was entirely mine. Nobody else's emergencies had paid for this. Nobody else's guilt trips had influenced my choices. Every piece of furniture, every dish, every towel, was something I'd picked out and purchased with money I'd earned and kept. That night after Damon left, I went to the grocery store and bought real food. Fresh vegetables and chicken breasts and pasta and ingredients for actual meals. The total came to $80, and I paid it without my hands shaking or my stomach dropping. I got home and made myself dinner in my own kitchen, and it felt like the most luxurious thing I'd ever done. I ate at my small dining table and looked around at my clean, quiet apartment, and felt something I hadn't felt in 3 years. Peace. 2 months after the frozen cat incident, I got a call from the prosecutor's office. Cassandra had pleaded guilty to insurance fraud. She received 2 years probation, a $5,000 fine, and mandatory community service. The judge also ordered her to pay restitution to me and Vikram for the money she'd fraudulently obtained. The prosecutor said it was a good outcome considering Cassandra had no prior criminal record. I thanked her and hung up feeling absolutely nothing. That evening, my dad called to tell me about the sentencing. He said my mom was devastated by the conviction, still convinced that Cassandra just needed more support and understanding. But he told her this was the consequence of years of enabling, and maybe now Cassandra would finally be forced to change. He said my mom was struggling to accept that her protection had actually hurt Cassandra more than helped her. I asked how Cassandra was handling it, and he said she was angry, blaming everyone but herself. He sighed and said he hoped the probation officer would be able to get through to her in ways the family never could. We talked for a few more minutes about nothing important, and then said goodbye. I sat on my balcony watching the sunset and thought about how different my life looked now. No more emergency texts, no more guilt trips, no more double shifts to fund someone else's lies. Just my own quiet life in my own clean apartment, finally mine to live however I wanted. 3 weeks later, I walked into my first therapy appointment and sat on a couch that didn't smell like mold. The therapist's office had plants on the windowsill and art on the walls, and it felt strange to be somewhere clean and professional that I was paying for with money I'd kept for myself. She asked me to describe what brought me in, and I started talking about Cassandra and the frozen cat, but realized pretty quickly that wasn't really the problem. The problem was 3 years of saying yes when I meant no, of eating ramen while someone else ate brunch, of believing that being responsible meant sacrificing everything. She listened without interrupting, and then said something that made my chest tight. I'd been conditioned my whole life to be the fixer, the responsible one who held everything together while everyone else fell apart. Breaking that pattern wasn't selfish. It was necessary for my survival. The sessions cost $150 each week, and I could actually afford them without checking my bank account first, or calculating how many double shifts I'd need to work. That felt wonderful and sad at the same time, knowing I'd had this money all along but had been giving it away to someone who never appreciated it. Over the next few weeks, I kept going back, learning to recognize the guilt trips for what they were, and understanding that Cassandra's problems were never mine to fix. My therapist helped me see that my parents had put me in an impossible position, making me responsible for my sister's well-being while never holding her accountable for her own choices. It wasn't about being mean or cutting off family. It was about recognizing that I couldn't help someone who didn't want to help themselves. One morning, about 2 months into therapy, my dad called and said he had something from Cassandra. I told him to bring it by, and he showed up that evening with a sealed envelope. I took it from him, and he left without trying to convince me to read it or respond, which felt like progress. I sat at my kitchen table staring at the envelope for probably 20 minutes before finally opening it. The letter was 3 pages long, handwritten, and covered in crossed-out words and tear stains. Cassandra apologized for everything: the lies, the manipulation, the frozen cat scheme, all of it. She said she'd been in denial about how bad her behavior had gotten, and that losing everyone's trust had forced her to look at herself honestly for the first time. The letter asked if we could eventually reconcile. Not now, but someday when I was ready, if I ever was. I read it once and then folded it back up and put it in my desk drawer. I wasn't ready to respond, and I wasn't sure I ever would be, but I also wasn't ready to throw it away. At my next therapy session, I mentioned the letter, and my therapist said that was perfectly okay. I didn't owe Cassandra forgiveness on any timeline but my own, and it was healthy to acknowledge that I needed space without feeling guilty about it. The lack of pressure to immediately make everything okay felt revolutionary, like someone had finally given me permission to put myself first. 4 months after blocking Cassandra's number, I ran into my mom at the grocery store. I was in the produce section picking out actual fresh vegetables when I heard her voice behind me. We both froze for a second, and then she asked how I was doing in this careful, formal way that made it clear she didn't know how to talk to me anymore. I said I was fine and asked about her. She told me Cassandra had gotten a job at a retail store and was actually showing up every day, that her probation officer checked in regularly, and she hadn't missed any of her community service hours. My mom's voice had this edge to it, like she wanted credit for Cassandra's progress, like she was waiting for me to say I was proud or that I'd been too harsh. I just said I was glad Cassandra was taking responsibility for her actions, and then excused myself to finish shopping. It wasn't warm, but it wasn't hostile either, just the reality of a relationship that had been permanently changed. She didn't try to hug me or suggest we get coffee, and I didn't offer my new address or phone number. We were family, but we weren't close anymore, and maybe we never really had been. That evening, I sat in my clean apartment eating chicken and vegetables I'd cooked myself while Damon looked at vacation packages on his laptop. We were planning a trip to the beach, something I hadn't done since college because every spare dollar had gone to emergencies that weren't real. He showed me pictures of hotels, and I picked one that was nice but not too expensive, still getting used to the idea that I could spend money on myself without guilt. As we talked about beach days and restaurants and doing absolutely nothing productive, I realized I was genuinely happy for the first time in years. The family situation was still messy and probably always would be. Some relationships were damaged beyond full repair, and I'd made peace with that. But I was building a life that was mine instead of constantly sacrificing for someone who never appreciated it. Cassandra was facing real consequences and maybe learning to stand on her own feet. My parents were working through their issues in therapy. And I was finally free from the obligation to fix everything and everyone. It wasn't a perfect ending where everyone learned a beautiful lesson and came together for holidays. It was real, and it was mine, and that was enough.